maybe 20 years at the outset. So you'll see that that really only takes us out to about 2030, 2035 usually. And then they are, of course, to the extent that they can be, informed by these longer term scenarios that we've been discussing this evening, but oftentimes they're not necessarily concretely translated when it comes to the actions that are prioritized, even in something like a NAP. I'm just going to leave my initial comments at that, because I do have just some reflections on what we've seen so far through the network based on country experiences, but I'd like to hand it over to the actual countries first before I share any of those, because they'll already say what I have to say.
Thanks very much for this, great. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to José Miguel, who is with the Brazilian government and heading 2 areas responsible for both mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And who is responsible for the preparation of the national strategy for the implementation of the Brazilian NDC. And we are wondering on your take about the question to what extent long-term planning is guiding NDC development and NDC implementation in Brazil, and how you see the challenges and the opportunities of introducing long-term planning into NDCs.
Yeah, as you say, it's for Brazil, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. For Brazil, it's a very challenging, very high challenge to try to follow Article 4.19. But the 4.19 says that all parties should strive to formulate and communicate long-term, low greenhouse gas emissions development strategies. It's a double problem for us, because we are a very low greenhouse gas emitting country. In our energy sector, we have 42% of the renewable energy in our energy sector. So basically, we have all the power generation through hydros and cogeneration using bagasse. We have a lot of ethanol being used in cars to fuel cars, and we have a lot of use of charcoal in the industry. So Brazil is a low carbon already, low carbon economy. So it's very hard to have a long-term planning to be even lower. And second, because it's very difficult for developing countries like Brazil to talk about long-term strategies for the long term. Even for the NDC, it's too complicated, because we try to plan 2025 and have an indication of our NDC for 2030. But even though, if you think 2030, we are going to have 4 elections in Brazil from now to 2030. So it is a challenge to know what will be the fate of different economic policies from 4 governments in the future. So this is the practical aspect. In the developing countries, very hard, different from developing countries, it's very hard to plan for the economic and social future, because we are still growing. We have to develop infrastructure. It's different from here. For normally, I used to say Brazil is growing very slowly compared to developing countries. We are growing at 1.6% per year, our population. But this means 1 Uruguay per year. And you have to build hospitals, schools, roads, and so on every year for equivalent on 1 Uruguay. So it's not simple. The 42% of our supply side renewable, you have to compare to OECD, for instance, is around 6%. And for the global average is about 13%. So our NDC aims to increase from 42 to 45. But you have to keep in mind that this is not a simple 3%, because the current economy is small compared to what we plan to have in the economy in the future. So 42% now is a small piece of pizza. 45% in 2030 is a big piece. So these are the challenges to compare the long-term strategy to NDC. In addition, the long-term strategy, we are talking about 50 years, 100 years. So in developing countries, it's practically impossible to try to figure out what will be our country in 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these insights from Brazil. Thank you very much. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Tura Maru, who is the Chief Director of Climate Change Adaptation in the Department of Environmental Affairs in South Africa. And while we've put the spotlight on NDCs in the Brazilian context, we're now taking a closer look at adaptation, the NAP dimension. So my question to you again is, to what extent, in the South African case, is long-term planning guiding NAP development? And what, in your view, are the challenges, the practical challenges, but also the opportunities of including long-term planning in NAPs?
Thank you very much, Clara. Good evening. I think from South African perspective, one of the key area of work which was undertaken by the Planning Commission is the National Development Plan, which Chapter 5 speaks about a transition towards a resilient economy. In that chapter, it talks about the need for us to put in place a national adaptation strategy. So from that perspective, having a 2030 vision with very clear vision, it gives the operating department an impetus to can then build the national adaptation strategies. Well, in us undertaking the adaptation strategy is one of the goals within our NDC. So there is this interlinkages to say what we've envisioned within the NDC, we now need to work towards putting it in place. We undertook a long-term adaptation scenarios, which started to give us some scenarios in terms of what are the sectors that will be affected, what are the risks that are going to affect those sectors. And we, of course, engage across the sectors and find that some of the sectors already had their sectoral plans for climate change, particularly adaptation. And I would say that's one of the feat that gave us the gain in terms of how do we then plan and how do we facilitate mainstreaming, because you already have the sectors that are working. So I would say upfront, that was a positive challenge, a positive leverage for us. And I think coming direct to the question, the benefit is we have a long-term planning, 2030 vision, managed from the presidency, which then everyone is rallying around it. So in our planning processes, we look at the long-term visions in terms of integrating elements around poverty eradication, elements around inequality, and we are able to identify what strategic sectors, what kind of resilient and adaptation interventions needs to be implemented. We are in the process of elaborating our national adaptation strategy. We have done an extensive work, and now we are just teasing out what are the strategic elements. And just to come in very briefly in terms of the element that we are looking at, it's around the issue of human capacity to respond. How are we capacitating our communities to can be able to respond? The element around reducing economic vulnerability, ensuring physical resilience, and the issue around institutional mechanisms. How do we ensure that we have institutional mechanisms that will help us in implementing it? But South Africa being one of the biomega diverse, we're looking at how do we utilize your natural infrastructure to facilitate resilient. One of the challenge is, you know, when you start mainstreaming and trying to bring the coherent, you find that the sector department have been doing their silo work, and breaking that silo, I would say it's one of the critical challenge that we find ourselves facing. but it requires quite a lot of coordination to say, how do you then deal with the trade-offs, whether from sector to sector, water affairs, trade-offs with agriculture, because at times you find that you really have to address the issues of trade-offs. Without taking much time, I would say, facilitator, those are some just to scan quite briefly, but I think the National Adaptation Strategy, in our view, is a very critical strategic document that would be able to, foster mainstreaming of adaptation across, or foster even climate change issues within a long-term plan for the country. So that's how we are looking at it, and we are making strides. Hence, there are those silos that we need to work on. We currently, in closing, working on the legal options in terms of how can we facilitate compliance across sectors, how can we facilitate compliance across all the actors. So these legal options is one of the options that I think will give us a hand in terms of compliance. In a nutshell, I think that would be my intervention.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for these insights from South Africa. Now a few words from the perspective of the global network, the NAP Global Network, which aims to enhance national adaptation, planning, and action in developing countries. And the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I won't take up too much time, actually. Just a couple of points I wanted to share. I'd say one of the I don't know, maybe it's a challenge, but also an opportunity with national adaptation plans and the planning process is I think there's a broad recognition that these, again, are supposed to be medium and longer term. Their objectives are ultimately to reduce the vulnerability to the impacts of climate change through building adaptive capacity, and then, of course, integrating adaptation into different sector plans and development planning processes. So those are the objectives. They can be short-term, medium-term, long-term. And I think there's a recognition, like I said, that these are supposed to be more than urgent and immediate needs. But that said, to even get to the medium and longer term, there are actual immediate needs that need to be met, sort of very foundational needs that need to be met. And so you'll see in a lot of these national adaptation plan conversations that the short-term measures that are identified are really around whether it's capacity building, awareness raising, institutional strengthening, institutional coordination mechanisms, very, like I said, foundational actions that are in a lot of these NAPs. And then, of course, there are some critical knowledge gaps that some countries feel need to be filled before they can actually really think longer term. So you see a lot of calls for different, whether it's sectoral or particular geographic or ecosystem assessments that they feel need to be undertaken to, again, identify the longer term strategies. That said, I think there are a number of countries that are aware of the longer term challenge that lays ahead. And so the challenge is going to be taking, I think, the sort of discreetly commissioned pieces of research and work that have been undertaken in recognition of these longer term challenges and really linking them with the NAP conversation. I mean, everybody knows that these sort of multi-sectoral, multi-governance processes are complicated, and it's easy to oversee or overlook, these critical pieces of research. But some countries, for example, are coming up with things like relocation guidelines to deal with the longer term challenge of sea level rise and things like that. So how do you make sure that what's in those guidelines, A, reflects the latest science, so keeping it iterative, but also gets linked to that NAP process. And so I think there are some more and more opportunities bubbling up in the countries. But again, it's just making sure you're aware of what's happening, in real time, really. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne. Let's take time for one round of question and answers. And I'm happy to take your questions or comments. Please briefly say who you are and what your affiliation is. And who you would like to address your question to. I'll take the first 2 or 3 questions and comments. Okay, Paula in the front.
Thank you very much, and thanks for sharing these very rich experiences. It's nice to sort of have a sense of ground truthing things. So, Jose, I just wanted to follow up on your the very important point that you made about the fact that in developing countries, economies are growing indeed very fast. And I'm just wondering your takeaway, because from my perspective, precisely because of that need for that very rapid growth, that's where there is that opportunity for making sure that that growth is not just resilient, but really builds in the best technology and is really driving growth, that's sort of relevant for the 21st century, which means really making sure that you create opportunities for the best technologies that are out there for land and spatial planning that will have much better cities with a lower carbon footprint, but that lower carbon footprint also translating into just better, more livable cities. So do you think that there's an inherent tension between that rapid growth and making that rapid growth, ensuring that there's no lock-in effect in that rapid growth? Is there a trade-off there, or is there something that you can look at? And I'm thinking of, for example, in the climate economy reports, where you actually, the argument's been made that by doing it differently and doing it in a more transformational way, you're actually, over the longer term, also building in a lot of cost efficiencies and savings and better path development trajectories.
Thank you. Okay, one more in the back. We're collecting a few.
I promised Cleo that I would ask him a difficult question from the floor, but it's not a difficult one. I'm Jaco de Tooy from WWF in South Africa. So as you've heard, South Africa has done a lot of work on the national adaptation strategy and a lot of the other work related to it. But quite often when we meet with local community representatives and people that are really at the forefront of these impacts, they feel that the impacts they face are so unique and that it's very hard to understand how these national level policies and things like adaptation strategies and NDCs are going to affect their lives. So it'll be interesting to hear a little bit of if Mr. Amuro has done any further thinking on that, but also to hear some other experiences of how countries are dealing with this issue of having these great national plans on adaptation, but how do you bring that home to people that really face the impacts and where a generic national strategy might not feel like it reflects their needs?
Thank you very much. Great. So, over to you, Jose. The potential of long-term urbanization.
No, I agree with you in terms of opportunities. It's a huge opportunity for the country. I agree completely. That's why in our NDC, and in Brazil is a different case, like I said, because we have the planning of Brazil was always oriented to renewable energy. We started building hydros in 1960s. So it was a different, we started the ethanol program in 1970s. So it's a different kind of planning in the Brazilian system that was oriented for renewable. At that time, the climate change was not an issue, of course. So we cannot say that this was done because of climate change, like people are now linking everything to climate change. This was not done because of climate change. And the hydros was an economic decision that was cheaper, even in 1960s with very cheap oil price. And in 70s, because of the first oil crisis, the price raise of the oil. So these decisions were not linked to climate change, of course. But once you have all the economy oriented to renewable energy, it's very hard to think differently, let alone in these conditions now, that we had very high prices of oil. So we still have the planning of the country oriented to renewable energy. That's why we still, in the NDC, we plan to increase the share of renewable energy to 45%. And as you said, this is a big opportunity. For instance, we are now oriented for hydro. More than 90% of our power generation comes through hydros. But we are facing shortages of rainfalls. So, and the reservoirs are very low. At the current status is about 36%, the reservoirs. So because of lack of rainfalls in Brazil. So this puts a challenge. So we are dealing now with wind power because when there is no rain, there is a lot of wind. So they are complementary in a sense. So we are now going through wind power, and we plan to have solar power because in Brazil, different from here, we have sun during the whole year. It's sky clear all the time. So, but this creates a challenge again. The opportunity creates challenge because now hydro and cogenerations bagasse are seasonal. You have the dry season and the wet season. And for bagasse, we have the harvesting of sugarcane and out of the harvest, out of the season. And for wind power and solar power, they are intermittent. You don't have solar during the night, you don't have wind every hour in the day. So we are moving from a hydro system that was firm energy to a system that is both seasonal and intermittent. So this places a very challenging future for us because we have to have some kind of firm energy that would come from thermal power plants. So this is the challenge, how you can go to the limit of renewable energy, but guaranteeing that you are at no time without any source of electricity. So these are the challenge. But and for the long term is even worse because for the power sector we plan 20 years. So this is long term for us in the NDC. The NDC were about 16 years that we're planning. This is a planning that is commensurate with the power sector planning. But for the oil sector, for instance, it's just 10 years. So they don't plan 20 years ahead, let alone 50 years. So this is a very challenging for all sectors in Brazil. Thank you.
How about connecting the great efforts to promote national planning with what's going on the ground?
No, thank you very much. He lived to the promise that he gave me. But I think I like the dimension that he's bringing in terms of the vulnerable people who are affected on the ground. We've developed what we call the National Framework for Climate Services. And with the National Framework for Climate Services, we are looking at developing products, be it early warning, be it messaging, which we can then start to engage with communities upfront so that they are well capacitated. I think often the challenge that we face is at times we want to deal with the National Adaptation Strategy as a silo, as a separate strategy. We don't locate other supporting mechanisms. But further than that, we have very interesting pilot projects on the ground, funded through the Adaptation Fund, where you are dealing with the issue of food security. The other one, we are dealing with the issue of the flood warnings. You are engaging with the farmers on the ground. And those are some of the leverages that we use. We engaging with the municipalities. We have what we call Let Us Response Toolkit. So we go down to the municipalities and be able to capacitate them in terms of what are the climate change. We worked with them in mapping the risks across various geographical spaces, which are at a local level. And we even work towards ensuring that they integrate climate change into their planning processes. And through that, I think we are able to filter down. One of the critical learning that we drew is from the extreme event. We know that South Africa is still trying to get out of the grip of drought, and we had heat waves, and so we started to utilize those challenges, those experiences, and start to engage at a local level where people start to see the real impact of climate change. And I think it's quite important to connect with the communities at that level, because these are the people who are at the brunt of the impact of climate change.
Thank you very much. Oh, wonderful. This concludes part 3 of this side event. And it was very interesting to hear about your country experiences and insights from country cases on the relationship between long-term planning on the one hand and NDCs and NAPs on the other. So thank you very much. We're now moving into part 4 of this side event, which puts the spotlight on fostering effective long-term planning. And it's my pleasure to keep the two of you here on the panel. At the same time, it's my pleasure to welcome some additional panelists to come forward and join us here on the panel. We have Paula Caballero from WRI joining us. We have Imme Scholz from the German Development Institute joining us. We have Sid Patak from the 2050 Pathways platform contributing. And that completes our panel. Wonderful. So let's begin part 4. Earlier today, we heard from Ingrid Hofen how this side event is about connecting the dots. In this last part of the side event, we're really trying to focus on how we can foster long-term planning. And that's about 3 different types of questions. First of all, how can we harness scenario-based approaches? For example, how can we incorporate them in some sort of rolling planning, in iterative processes? How can we incorporate all the insights they deliver into national and regional planning? And this does not only concern emission pathways, but also insights into migration dynamics, population dynamics, climate impacts. For example, how can we better harness the science policy interface? The second set of questions concerns adaptive capacities and building resilience. How can we make sure that we deal adequately with slow onset events like sea level rises, for example? And last but not least, more concretely, how can we support approaches and instruments to promote long-term planning? How can we forge the right alliances, the ones we need to make use of long-term planning? And we'll kick off now the panel with inputs again from the 2 country perspectives. And I'm interested to learn from you, Turamaru. What do you think about how NDCs and NAPs, perhaps more NAPs in your case, help support the development of effective long-term strategies and vice versa? And also how these processes can make use of long-term development, emission, and climate change impact scenarios. So how can we harness the potential of scenario-based approaches in your view?
Thank you very much. And I think just to kickstart, in my view, the issue of undertaking a long-term planning scenario, it's quite very crucial, because it's through that where you'll be able to characterize the risks. And when you able to characterize what are the risks that are associated with climate change, particularly for a country such as South Africa, and you'll be able to vividly start demonstrating the economic implications, be it the cost of maladaptation vis-a-vis the cost of planning in advance. So you would be able to catch the eye of the legislator and catch the eye of even the political level. So in our view, utilizing the NEP starts to help us to say these are some of the risk profile that you have, and these will be the cost that are associated with those risks across the various sectors. And this is how best we think from the National Adaptation Strategy point of view, you can try to address those risks. And I think it's one key area that if we leverage in our view, would be able to make a case even across various sectors and even at a political level. So those would be upfront my quick elements to say science-based, and the scientist has a tendency of talking among themselves. So if you start to talk science and bring all the various aspects of science, the socio-economics, you would be able to catch a high. But if you come and give us complicated models, we all look at them, and we can look at them from the scientific perspective. But think about the social aspect of things, think about the economic aspect of things, make those interlinkages. In that context, you will be able to factor in these science-based approaches.
Thank you very much. So you're echoing Bill Hare's plea for better science policy interface. Yes. Okay. Now over to you, Jose. What's your take from a Brazilian and broader perspective against technology?
And in our case, the NDC was focusing on mitigation, because for us it's a very challenging mitigation problem because of deforestation, first of all. Deforestation in Brazil is a huge area. The Brazilian Amazon part is about 3.5 million square kilometers, so it's the size of Europe, more or less. And it's a very high challenge again to cope with deforestation in Amazon, because normally it's illegal deforestation. So we have to increase the enforcement. This was one piece of our NDC, and we have to rely on modeling. We have to use a lot of modeling in Brazil. We have satellite surveys of the Amazon every 16 hours. We have a very complete scheme of the surveillance of Amazon in the case of deforestation. And to intervene there is very complicated, because you have to go there to places where there is no access by road. Normally, you have to go by river or by helicopter. And for energy sector is the easiest, because as I said, it's renewable, and we have a tradition of long-term planning, but long-term meaning 20 years, most 20 years of planning. And for agriculture is a short-term planning. It's not a very long-term planning, because it depends on several factors that people cannot control. So agriculture, we have to have a trend and to improve the technology in the agricultural sector, but it's very hard to have a long-term planning. But anyway, in the case of agriculture, the main emission of Brazil is cattle, emissions from cattle, methane emissions from cattle. And enteric fermentation, this is a completely different subject, because it's very hard to mitigate these emissions. So what we put in our NDC were measures that were directly compensating these, or through increasing digestibility of the cattle, or through trying to have more manage conditions for the cattle, for the feeding of the cattle. So, but this would be indirect measures to decrease emissions. So these are three different aspects. We have to model these three different aspects. We have to plan what is Brazil in the long term. That is very complicated to do in the case of the developing countries. In adaptation, it's a completely, I didn't answer the question of my colleague from South Africa, but it's a different subject in Brazil, because first, the modeling of IPCC, you have completely different scenarios for the 16 models for precipitation. And in the case of Brazil, precipitation is key because of the hydroelectric power sector. So, and we don't have a clear signal from IPCC what to do. So what we can do is to try to improve the resilience, as was said by my South African colleague, in the sense that we have to go for the existing vulnerabilities, both socioeconomic, and try to measure it and try to increase the resilience, trying to cope with these types of vulnerabilities. We have advanced in terms of early warnings, but this is more general than climate change. It's about climate weather, it's about climate system, it's about other events like earthquakes that are not related to climate change. But anyway, this is a kind of incipient systems that encompass the whole country. To keep the early warning system that could, in a sense, start measuring vulnerability, measure the extreme events, and start actions in the field, in the localities that are more vulnerable to cope with climate change in the future. So we are advancing all these areas. Thank you.
Thank you. So there already seems to be some awareness of the importance of taking scenario-based approaches into account. But I guess the plea, Bill Harris' plea to improve the science policy interface is still highly relevant, despite some promising experiences. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Imme Scholz, who is the deputy director of the German Development Institute, and also a member of the German Council for Sustainable Development. And my question to you is, how do you see the opportunities and the challenges of long-term planning and long-term strategies? And how are these relevant when we think about the big transitions, the big transformation our societies will have to go through?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. And I think I would like to stress the important relationship between long-term planning and scenarios, really. The longer the term you plan for, the higher the speculative share of what you are doing. And the more important it is to be explicit about the horizon of goals you are planning with. And I would like to make the combination of NDCs or climate scenarios, which usually where long-term means 2050 or 2070, and a broader agenda like the 2030 agenda, where many more goals are put into the horizon. So it's not only adaptation and mitigating climate change, reducing emissions and achieving decarbonization scenarios, but combine them with the social goals and other environmental goals and economic goals, especially in growing societies, so where population growth is a factor, or where large shares of population are underserviced. So the first thing when we look at long-term planning as an opportunity is to make scenarios where you combine goals, where you say, and I heard that the deep decarbonization pathways project has been mentioned before, where I particularly find interesting the case of the South African deep decarbonization pathway, because it was the major goals which should be addressed by that was reducing emissions and increasing employment. And so the question was, which combination of technologies and education measures create what scenarios and what emission and economic growth and job growth perspectives over time. Because, and that is the interesting approach of this backcasting, where you set your goals and then explore different pathways which bring you there. And I think that this is a very important step, because it gives you a tool for having a clearer view of what we have been calling trade-offs and synergies all the time. Yeah, and I think you need to have a clearer understanding of how these develop, these trade-offs and synergies, when they occur, and how they change over time, and what it means for your choice of technologies and other measures and the combination of those. So in that sense, I think it's an opportunity to address goals which maybe in the short term appear as trade-offs, and in the midterm or longer term can be where these trade-offs can be reduced. It is. So I think that is a major opportunity. Of course, change is complex and sequential, and it requires also investment over the long term. So what we say in climate policy is that we have to take the right decisions now to avoid irreversible change after some decades. And you mentioned the slow onset impacts also. But I think that we also have to be clear that policy change is also sequential. And not all investments, even if we take the decision now, it takes time to build new cities, to build energy infrastructure, mobility infrastructure, etc. But also to invest in human capital, to invest in human resources. We have a lot of experience in Germany with structural change, where we know that that the trade-offs are real. There's often generations. It takes generations for coming to terms with changes in where you get jobs. So I'm with the challenges now. And there, I think the challenges obviously are connected with the uncertainty when you think over long term. So how do you secure continuity over time in following the long-term plans you have designed? How do you, what do you do when political constellations change and commitment to that long-term plan is not there anymore? Of course, you can have it as a law. We don't have our national strategy for sustainable development in Germany. It's not a law. So it's easy to disobey and to not follow it. And there is social pressure, there is public pressure, but in the past, its goals have been ignored, and there is no instrument for ensuring a commitment to it. So climate policy is often defined as a law, and that may help, but it's also not an insurance. There is no insurance for that. So how to ensure continuity in terms of political will and in terms of commitment to implementation. Then I think the other challenge is how to factor in technological change. Especially in climate policy, we have a firm belief that technological change will help us to achieve decarbonization goals. And but we also know that there are many interactions between technological development and jobs, for example. So that's my plea for using science and scenario building for getting a clearer view on the interactions between these different factors. And the changing international context obviously is also a challenge. So your last point was how to govern transition, and that is the difference from long-term goals to transition programs and measures. And there, I think you will only have the opportunity of having programs which contribute to a just transition if your scenarios already mirror the combination of goals you're actually pursuing. Otherwise, you don't have the information basis for designing just transition scenarios which are more in the short term. These need to be, and this has been said by colleagues before, there you think in 5 or 10 years steps. And there, of course, the important thing is that these policies and programs are based on on shared norms and objectives that help you to address also the cross-sectoral effects and linkages, so that the advances you make in one sector do not undermine the progress you want to achieve in other sectors. And the example which is often given is land and water use with regards to BECS, or with in competition with food production, in competition with biodiversity protection, and in competition with the growing use of land for infrastructure. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for making the case for using backcasting to strengthen the potential of synergies and co-benefits and take them into account in long-term planning, while at the same time outlining the challenges of short-term government cycles that provide a problem, of course, for long-term planning potentially. At the same time, a lot of potential for synergies and co-benefits once we take long-term planning and scenario-based approaches into account. Thank you. Yeah, moving on towards the question, what kind of instruments and approaches can help the challenges that the other speakers outlined? How can we forge the right kind of alliances to make progress? And that's what I'd like to ask you also, Sid Partak, as Director of Partnerships for the 2050 Pathways Platform. And I'm interested to hear your take on how the 2050 Pathways Platform can support seeking those seeking to devise long-term net zero greenhouse gas, climate resilient and sustainable development pathways. So what can approaches like the 2050 Pathways Platform achieve?
Thank you. So let me start off by saying that I think that in order for us to look at 2050, though it looks as if it's very far away, it's 33 years, it's not that far in a certain sense. And I think that it's very good to come after Amy, which basically where she made the argument of backcasting. And I think the establishment of the platform was primarily based on the fact that most of the countries broadly know where they want to go. Like there is a sense of aspiration across all countries, developed or developing. But I think the question of how becomes a challenge for most of them. And I think the other part which happened in 2015 is the goal for this backcasting, which is basically the Paris Agreement that has given us a very clear Article 2, which can basically be the sort of core of that backcasting, where you're actually trying to work with this Article 2 objectives as well as the country aspirations, and then try to see what are the sort of immediate policy, what are the sort of things that are required. So the idea for the platform was primarily to try and see, to not be prescriptive, but to actually be enabling and supportive in developing these plans in itself. So that's how the platform emerged. And just for a quick background, the platform actually was announced in Marrakesh under the leadership of Laurence Toubiana, who was the high-level champion at that point, and currently has 22 countries, it has 15 cities, it has 17 regions, as well as 196 businesses. So there is quite a lot of interest across different actors to carry out in development of these plans. As far as the platform is concerned, I think one of the big things that we realized immediately was the 2050 plans are not about just technical scenarios. It's about trying to get maximum ownership from those technical scenarios. Like it was said earlier, the governments might change, there might be a different perspective on how we need to move forward, but I think it's the ownership of solutions that the platform intends to deliver on. It's about trying to help countries. Obviously, there are different levels of capacities across countries. So the platform will obviously help with the technical scenario building process. It will try to come out with some sort of a handbook that can help countries who are at a very early starting point to understand what is needed in these technical scenarios. But a big part of the platform would be to try and have dialogues and try to support dialogues across sectors and within sectors around the choices that need to be made, around the strategic choices that need to be made, as well as the sort of ownership that needs to be generated around these choices that will come. It's primarily an idea of trying to do collective problem solving across a different sector, set of actors. The second part is about bringing in new actors. I think it's not just about countries and cities and the governments across national and subnational levels doing these plans, but it's about all the actors like the financial sector or the development banks that will play a huge role in this transformation and in this transition, as well as in enabling this transition. The financial sector, along with the technological, the innovation sector, that would be extremely important to bring in, and they are not necessarily part of the discussion, unfortunately, here in the UNFCCC. And that's the point of the platform, to try and get these actors who can play a very enabling and supportive role for countries, for governments to actually develop these plans. Another big part of the platform is to try and see how we can work with verticality, and that's an example that I want to bring. I come from India, and a lot of you might know that Indian cities are not the cleanest right now. There's a lot of pollution, air pollution in these cities. So the first actor that Indian government looked at in order for bilateral cooperation was not a city, but actually Singapore, which is a city-state to a certain extent, and trying to get solutions from them on smart cities. So the idea of verticality is not about the idea of verticality is about trying to ensure that we are having that learning across different verticals. So countries can learn from cities can learn from businesses. There is a lot of knowledge that can be shared, and actually having a space to share that knowledge is another reason for the platform to try and see how we can enhance that sharing of knowledge across the vertical, across different actors in themselves. And lastly, I think one of the key focus of the platform would be to try and maintain international momentum around these plans in itself. Right now, in the Paris Agreement, it's an invitation. We would definitely like to see all countries and all sort of key actors develop these plans. And the platform with its partners and members will definitely try and see how we can ensure that there is international momentum around these plans in order to actually try and better understand the choices that are at hand for different countries and actors, as well as in order to support in ensuring that those choices, the right choices, are actually made in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much for these promising insights from the 2050 Pathways platform. And I think it has become apparent here on the panel and also during our discussion of the country cases earlier, how much potential long-term strategies hold, both for aligning short-term needs and long-term planning, but also to avoid the wrong kind of decisions, to avoid lock-ins, and to foster innovation by sending the right kinds of signals and setting the right kind of incentives. So last but not least, it's my pleasure to hear from you, Paula, from the World Resources Institute, how you think we can promote effective long-term planning and what kind of approaches and instruments might be useful in that regard.
Thank you very much. It's challenging to come at the end of a long day for everybody, and after not just this panel, but very insightful and rich discussion. So I don't want to repeat what a lot of what has said. So let me highlight a few things and maybe bring in some simplistic views to this. At the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is move away from incrementalism. And I think that that's a very important message, that incrementalism is what got us into the bind, and incrementalism is not going to get us out of here. So if you understand that assumption, then the natural movement is to start to understand, okay, what different kind of approach is needed. And I would really like to take the opportunity here to commend Laurence Tubiana for the enormous leadership she has brought to this issue of making 2050 strategies much more of a reality and translating it for policymakers in a way that makes it something that, as was very rightly said, is not just for governments, but is for companies, it is for subnational actors and others. So how we move away from that incrementalism, I think, is also, there's very weighty reasons for it. One that has been noted is that it becomes more costly. Let me say that if I can recall what Ingrid said earlier, becomes more costly because it's going to shut out development options. That linkage between the NDCs and the SDGs, the understanding, as Ingrid said, that you will not be able to deliver on the SDGs if you don't tackle climate, and that if you turn it around, there's enormous and very rich potential for being able to deliver on both. That's where the 2050 strategies come in. They help to bring to the fore, they help to translate, they help to identify where those sweet spots are, where the opportunities are, that will enable countries to make the decisions now that will keep development options open into the future. Because we talk about lock-in, and I'll talk about lock-in in a minute, but I think we should also start talking about lock-out. When I was in my previous incarnation, I was at the World Bank, and one of the ways that I started to get a much more greater traction in terms of getting governments to look at environment and climate change differently is to say, what are the development options that you're locking out? If you take the wrong decisions now, what are you going to not be able to do in the future? And that really changes the conversation, because then you start to realize that, as we keep saying, 2050 is now. The decisions you're taking right now are going to define whether you can irrigate X number of hectares or millions of hectares in the coming years, what kind of jobs you're going to be able to have, what kind of cities, what kind of livelihoods, what kind of, and the list goes on, right? So starting to look at that lockout function is very important. And I'd like to build on what Ines was saying about land use and security. I'd like to bring that much more to the fore, because if you think about what she was saying and what Jose was saying in terms of the fact that Brazil is facing greater droughts, then all of a sudden land use and the kind of decisions you take about land use also lock you into different pathways. So we need to look at the issues of what you're locking in and what you're locking out in from much more of a development perspective. And to understand also that this is much more dramatic, and I use that adjective with intent. It is much more dramatic for countries with lesser capacity and that are poor. And the reason for this is that a lot of what we're looking at is irreversible, and natural ecosystems and what we're looking at planetary boundaries are irreversible. And that has to be the overall imperative, which is forcing us to really think about how we go about development in a very different way. But irreversible also becomes something that affects economic and social systems much more rapidly if you have less capacity, if you have less resources, if you are lower on the development spectrum. And that's the case both for many developing countries as well as for poorer communities in countries that are pulling ahead. So the level of vulnerability that we always associate with when we say the poor are more exposed, the poor have lower coping ranges to address climate change impacts, well, they're also going to have lower capacity to revert the wrong choices that are being made today. So long-term strategies are essentially also about long-term poverty eradication, because as I always like to say, what are you doing about tomorrow's poverty? Because tomorrow's poverty is going to be much more difficult. There's going to be less resources. We're going to be dealing with impacts of a nature that we do not yet understand. So long-term strategies are at their essence also a poverty eradication modality, a poverty eradication strategy is the word I was looking for. And then in terms of the lock-in, right, you were looking at the fact that you're making decisions now that, one, you might be building stranded assets, either stranded assets because you're building the coal power plant that will maybe not become untenable from the point of view of the use of the potential to use the coal plant. And you see right now in some countries that you still have power plants in the pipeline, but they're not being built. And the reason they're not being built is because market forces are indicating the coal is simply not competitive. So the same situation you have to translate into what kind of buildings are you building today, and what kind of vehicle fleets are you incentivizing? What kind of vehicle fleets are you looking at? Are you, for example, looking to move from coal to natural gas? That seems to be correct from a short-term cost perspective, but you're bringing in a different dimension of lock-in, because you should already start to be looking at how you can have zero carbon technologies that will enable you to develop and to deliver that same kind of energy. And that's why I was very happy to be on the panel with Brazil, because Brazil is a country, as Jose was rightly saying, wasn't initially from a carbon perspective, from a climate perspective, but the fact is that it delivers much greater energy security over the long term. And I think in the urban space, which is something we've heard a lot about today, it's also important to understand for developing countries how the decisions today can create more resilient and livable cities tomorrow by having the right kind of building efficiency, by having the right kind of transport. So let me just sum up by saying that I think that if we start to look at 2050 strategies, not only as a modeling exercise and not as an exercise that should be the purview or the privilege of countries that have enormous installed capacity. If we start to look at 2050 strategies as a way of ensuring that the near-term decisions are decisions that are going to be able to maximize the limited resources and capacity of all countries, and in particular developing countries, to keep those development options in the future, to avoid the lock-in and the lockout, then that comes to the question of that it becomes much easier to be able to get this perspective within and to bring it into national development planning, which is really where it has to be. How are you allocating your budgets? What kind of development planning is happening, both at national and at sectoral level? And when we can bring this perspective to policymakers, to decision makers, and embed this kind of a perspective in the decisions, then 2050 really does become now. And that's a very essential part of the backcasting, because that's going to change the decision-making processes today. And that's what tackling climate change is ultimately about. And we will have other enormous benefits across the entire range of the SDGs. So 2050 strategies, I think if there's a take-home message, is that this is not, it should not be seen as a very difficult and challenging, complicated exercise that is something that you aspire to when you've dealt with other issues, or that you cannot tackle right now because you have other priorities. I think 2050 strategies are essential, especially for developing countries, to make sure that they can maximize the resources now and over the longer term. So as I've said, it's difficult to come after such a exciting and innovative and rich and productive conversation today. But I think that if this is one of the take-home messages, this entire, and you can all become ambassadors more and more for this kind of a perspective, that this is really one of the key ways that we're going to be able to tackle climate change.
Thank you very much for this encouraging perspective. And for, again, making the case for putting long-term strategies at the forefront. Thanks very much. Now the floor is yours. It's about your questions and comments, and you're welcome to raise your hand if you'd like to share your perspective or ask a question to the panelists. Or are we ready after a long day for winding down? And okay, I see one hand here. Okay, yes, please. You can use the catch box if you can. And if you'd like to say your name briefly.
Yes, I'm Gunnar Olesen, International Network for Sustainability. Actually, the question was mostly for Siddharth, but maybe others would like to respond also. We heard all these good reasons to make these long-term strategies, and you've taken upon yourself to make a 2050 pathways platform, which is basically defining these strategies. So how do you imagine that you will plan in your platform to take these good ideas and get the countries actually to take them in and make these long-term strategies that we now have in the Paris Agreement and many others have been speaking about?
Would you like to respond?
Sure. I think it's not about the platform. Like I said in the beginning, it's not about the platform being prescriptive, but it's about the platform being supportive. And I think that all these good ideas that were just said right now, I think we're pretty much on the same page. And most of those things are part of the discussions of the platform, and we're hoping that we can provide the sort of guidance, if needed, from countries around what are the sort of key elements of the plans, what are the sort of things that can be done. But it's not about the platform dictating the terms that this is what you need to do in order to join the platform or in order to be in the platform, but it's about the platform being a space of safe space and enabling space for countries as well as cities and businesses to have that conversation about tough choices, to have that conversation about what is the need of the hour, what are the things that would be helpful. So I think it's yeah, so I would keep it at that.
Okay, so two more questions. One over here to the left. Yeah, no, to your right, actually. And then we're moving to the left.
Wow.
Yes.
Thanks. Lina Dabak from Climate Action Network. So I heard a lot of good things on sustainable development and how the long-term strategies can actually help to support sustainable development. Do you see any formal linkages with the SDGs from the platform, but also from the country perspective? That would be my question. And
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, David Levi from IDRI. Just a quick comment because there was a couple of mentions of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways project, and I just wanted to add just a little note of that. There was two main findings that throughout the projects we kind of realized. The first one was the ability by having a number of scenarios put out and research team in countries working on them to kind of mainstream the climate discussion much further than just the climate community, which was very important through a number of stakeholders meeting, through a number of discussions with government and other institutions to build a common perspective on how they see the future of a country evolving. And so especially connecting with Ministry of Finance and then the financial community is really important to mainstream those ideas. And the second one was the fact that research teams throughout the world were working on scenarios for their own countries, but based on one vision of the world in 2050 or later. But we realized also that these research teams had very different conceptions of what the world would be, but the world will be the same whether you're in China or in Brazil. And so the idea of sharing those views together in one place, and that's why I think the platform is a very interesting place to do that, allows these assumptions to be confronted with other views from other sides of the world and kind of adjust who thinks what and what are the reasons for that, and it allows to evolve in that conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we're closing now the question and answer session. Before I go back to the panel, let me briefly say that if you check out online tools like the NDC Explorer, you'll find that, yes, there are some SDGs mentioned, or SDGs are mentioned in the NDCs. So that's one type of link, potentially. And we're currently in the process with partners of assessing in more detail what kind of sustainable development issues, themes are part of the NDCs. And if you do that, you find a lot of potential for synergies between NDC and SDG implementation. So that's encouraging also from a long-term strategy perspective. But let me ask who on the panel would like to share his or her final concluding takeaway message before we close this panel. And it's my pleasure to hand over to Ingrid Hofen for some concluding remarks. So who would like to share some final takeaway messages? Okay, Emma. Okay, so one final thought from Emma.
Yeah, I think this linkages between SDGs and NDCs. One thing is to analyze documents, whether SDGs appear in the horizon of the NDCs. But another approach is also to say, and that's why the scenarios are so important. What is it that you keep constant in terms of context, and what is it that you put on the level of a goal you want to achieve? You define yourself, like decarbonization by then and then. So many jobs linked to it, and it's important to be very clear about the difference between projections and scenarios where you define goals. Like when you think about projections that with population growth and increasing incomes, food and water demand will increase by 50%. So what is the background of that? Is it that we take consumption patterns for granted? Or is it that we say, what are the different opportunities or ways for achieving well-fed populations, growing populations, but without without contributing to biodiversity or contributing to further emissions growth? So these are the different perspectives which I think were you cannot look at the SDGs as a whole, but you can choose specific objective goals as an objective together with NDCs, and then see what opportunities are actually excluded and which are on the agenda. So that for me is an important addition. And of course, what are the SDGs after 2030? That is what is the compatibility of the time horizons? That is a big question, because many of the SDGs are actually reflexive goals. They are not set goals. They are reflexive. They depend on the societies which formulate them, support them, or don't support them.
Thank you again for underlining the opportunities of linking NDC and SDG implementation and identifying hopefully the sweet spots when looking at these two overarching goals. So let me thank the panelists for their insightful, inspiring inputs. Thank you very much to all of you. And it's now my pleasure to welcome, I'll actually leave my spot here. You can stay, I think. You can stay. I'll leave my spot for Ingrid Hofen. And it's my pleasure to welcome you on the panel for your concluding remarks and comments. Thanks.
I think now stay. I think I can do this.
Okay.
This was really for me a very good, it's nice. New technologies and innovation. So many thanks to the panelists, to previous panelists, and to all of you who have shared own questions and reflections with us. I think we are at the very early stage of a journey, but a journey certainly where we have to accelerate the pace. As people often say, the train has left the station, it left in Paris, but now it goes in a certain direction, but the question whether we are going at a sufficient speed. And then certainly while we are leaving the station, the big question is, are we leaving somebody behind? And this is actually the issue that was polarized when we have to combine the poverty eradication, the hunger eradication, the social agenda, the justice agenda, with what the Paris Agreement contains. Actually, when I look at the preamble of this beautiful agreement, so much is embedded, starting from human rights, gender equality, and the whole SDG agenda. Putting this into practice, I think, is a more complicated thing. And therefore, I think through the 2050 Pathway Platform, as well as the NDC partnership, we try really to give a hand to developing countries that probably are struggling now to get all these different dots together. Let's imagine, there is a finance minister, he's struggling to get his budget in place, try to elaborate a 3-year financial planning, try to contain indebtedness of his country. He still has a lot of poor people that don't have access to modern electricity, and then the government has committed to ambitious NDC. And partially, part of the NDC is conditioned. But even implementing this NDC, even if we all think they could do more, requires a lot of effort. And this has been pointed out by our friend from South Africa, because actually implementing the climate issue is cross-sectorial. It's not just about one ministry, the environment ministry. You have to convince your colleagues in energy, in water, in agriculture, in trade, and try to make the pitch to say, look, we have to be transformational, not incremental. So my takeaway is, quite frankly, is first, apparently, certainly there is more work to be done on scenario-based planning in order to inform long-term strategies and planning exercises. For me, a key conclusion is, unless we build up academic capacity, research capacity across the world, globally, not only in a few centers, we won't get enough voices into the dialogue that will actually inform decision-making over and over again, and find the next threshold to make our decision-making even better. The second point is, I think that if we invest more in research, academia, planning exercises, analysis, then we have to translate this even more into evidence-based decision-making. We are now in a time where we see a lot of news, not always we see perhaps the best news. The more I think it's important that we bring the evidence to the forefront. Strong IPCC, good studies, good voices from the academia and the research circles, think tanks. Yeah, to question our decisions. I mean, I'm in government, but I think we won't get better unless we get also constructive critical feedback from society, civil society, but also from our research institutions. So I see a lot. I mean, this is an investment area. Unless we do more in this area, I don't think that we are going to take the right decisions over time. My second takeaway is actually the connection, this was mentioned a couple of times, between the long-term strategic planning and the immediate implementation. I think it's not an either or, and this should not be perceived as the question whether this is more important, implementing the Paris Agreement, or the more immediate action or the NDC implementation, even if they are not perfect. It's not an either or. We have to do both at the same time. We have to connect those processes and make sure that when it happens on country level, they really speak to each other. If they don't speak to each other, we are going to miss big, big opportunities, and we don't have any time to lose. That's my third point. And finally, on SDG and the Paris Agreement interlinkages, it's so easily said. Quite frankly, I'm working in both spaces regularly, day to day, sometimes changing from hour to hour, the family I'm with. And there's still a lot to do. How, for instance, can we bring this wonderful debate to the high-level panel forum next year when they deal with agriculture? And how could we bring more from the development people to the climate arena so that they understand that this is not something about a report that was published by IPCC? It doesn't impact on development work. There is still a lot of literacy to be done, quite frankly, certainly in both camps. And the more we grab the opportunities that are out there, synergize and bring these different themes to the different fora, I think the more we are going to gain in momentum and collective leadership. So many thanks for your inspirational remarks, and especially to all the panelists for the efforts this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and you're now invited for wine and snacks outside.
Okay. Danke. Ja, war gut. Ja. Genau. Wäre auch ein riesiges Panel gewesen. Ne? Und so, glaube ich, Anfang, Ende war gut. Gut.
Thank you. I was just trying to say something different.